Hello, 8th grade. This is Mr. Crutcher again, and today we're going to be discussing Section 4, Nixon and Vietnam. And in Section 3, we finished with Richard Nixon winning the election of 1968. So now we're going to move forward a little bit, and Section 4 starts with his first year as presidency in 1969. Now in January, he gets off to a rough start. At his inauguration, there's a lot of protesters, anti-war demonstrators on Pennsylvania Avenue. That's the route of the parade for the president. You've got anti-Nixon posters as well. And it's a cold day, so Nixon is in the limousine. His limousine is getting pelted by sticks, stones, bottles. And this marked the first time that the parade had been disrupted like this in 180 years. So President Nixon, he had the task of dealing with the whole Vietnam situation, and he's trying to come up with something or an idea or strategy, and he comes up. He doesn't want to be making it look like he's defeated by pulling out all the troops all at once. So he comes up with this strategy known as peace with honor, and it had three parts. And the first part was the reform of the selective service, which basically meant the draft, there was going to be fewer men drafted. And what happened was, as part of this plan, college students could no longer obtain deferments, and only 19-year-olds would be called to service or drafted, and that they would be chosen on a lottery based on their birthday. The second part, he wanted to turn the responsibility over to the South Vietnamese, let them handle more, and this was known as Vietnamization. The third part, he authorized an expansion of the bombing to help the South Vietnamese troops, because remember in Section 3 we talked about how that was kind of hurting the American troops because they were more, they didn't really help as much as what the American troops would have liked. So he starts bombing to help these troops, and this bombing's destroyed the enemy supply routes and hideouts in Laos and Cambodia. However, this was kept secret. And one thing I forgot to mention when we were talking about him withdrawing troops slowly, in 1969, when it's his first year as president, there were more than 540,000 American troops in Vietnam. By the end of 1970, that number is down to 334,000. And then by 1971, that number is all the way down to 60,000. So you could see in over 2-year time the dramatic decrease in the amount of troops that were American troops, I should say, that was in Vietnam. So now we still have this opposition at home, and in late 1969, we have a protest in Washington, D.C., an anti-war protest where over 300 people showed up, and Nixon hoped the bombing raids would force the North Vietnamese to the peace table. Now, obviously, he would send Henry Kissinger to do those negotiations. However, the North Vietnamese, their strategy was pretty good. What they did was, instead of negotiating, they were going to wait it out because they knew about all these anti-war protests going on in the U.S., and they thought if they waited long enough that eventually these protests would force America to have to withdraw. So Nixon, in a speech on Vietnamization later in that year, in November 1969, he appealed to the silent majority. And those were remember, the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators. And he told them, or told everyone in his speech, that North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that. Expanding the war. Now, we have all this conflict going on in Vietnam, but then in Cambodia, which is Vietnam's neighbor, there's a civil war going on between communist and non-communist forces. So in April 1970, Nixon sent American troops to destroy the communist bases in Cambodia. And now this is outraging a lot of people. A lot of the American public, along with many people in Congress, are not happy with his decision to do that, because he wants to send, I think it was close to around 150,000 troops into Cambodia on this mission. And the reason why they were outraged and totally against this was they were saying he was invading a neutral nation and that he had overstepped his constitutional authority. Kent State. Now, because of what happened in Cambodia, the invasion, it sparked a series of protests on college campuses across the U.S. And one of those was at Kent State. What happened was some students, they burned a military building, so the governor declared martial law, was just basically emergency rule, military rule, I should say. So on May 4th, 1970, in Kent State, which is in Ohio, there was a clash between student protesters and members of the National Guard, and that ended in the death of 4 students. 13 others were wounded. And supposedly what happened, of course, there's students saying stuff to the National Guard, and supposedly they were throwing rocks, and I mean not just little rocks, good-sized rocks, broken concrete they were throwing at. The National Guard was, they feared for their lives, and that's when the shooting took place. Now another one happened at Jackson State, and on May 14th at Jackson State College, I should say, which is mainly an all-black college, there was a shooting. Police shot and killed 2 students after a night of campus violence. But this protest wasn't so much about Cambodia. It was more of a racial incident rather than what had happened in Kent State, which was strictly about the Cambodia incident. And these were just 2. There were many protests going across the country at colleges. Some schools even had to shut down for a while. But in both cases, Nixon blamed the protesters for the violence, and there was a commission that found that the shootings at Kent State were unjustified. But even with that finding, a majority of Americans seemed to side with Nixon. Peace at hand. Now, the U.S. sent representatives to continue peace talks with the representatives of North Vietnamese government, even during us bombing them and the protests going on in the U.S. So we're trying to have peace talks, and in March of 1972, the North gets a good push and with a huge offense against South Vietnam. So Nixon, he orders, basically more bombing of the North, and he also had the planting of mines in northern harbors. Now, peace at hand. Now, we just talked about how Nixon had ordered more bombings, and that was basically because we had fewer troops in Vietnam, so that's why he increased the bombing. But in order to get a peace settlement, he realized he was going to have to relax on his terms for peace. And so he stopped insisting that the North remove all of its forces from South Vietnam. And he ended up sending Henry Kissinger to meet privately with the North Vietnamese foreign minister to get a treaty done. And in the fall of 1972, just before presidential election, a peace agreement was reached. So it sounds good. However, there was a problem with that. They announced the peace agreement, but it collapsed because the president of South Vietnam, he objected to the North Vietnamese forces still being in the South. He thought they should all be removed. He didn't agree to this. So after winning re-election, Nixon was determined to put an end to the whole Vietnam War. So in December 1972, once again, U.S. forces unleashed a real heavy bombardment of the war on the North. This outraged U.S. citizens and the rest of the world. Okay, they're not happy with what Nixon is doing. He stood his ground, though, and North Vietnam soon returned to the peace table. So what happens is the U.S. puts a lot of pressure on South Vietnam to accept this peace treaty, and we're basically told them, look, sign this because we want to get out of here. And so there was an agreement reached January of 1973. And part of that agreement was the U.S. agreed to pull all of its troops out of Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese agreed to return all American POWs, which are prisoners of war. Okay, so the Paris Peace Accords ended the American involvement in Vietnam. However, the conflict there still continued. So with this conflict continuing, you have the North Vietnamese, they're not abandoning their goal of unifying Vietnam under their control. And in early 1975, they launched a major offensive against the South. And remember, the South Vietnamese army isn't real strong, and it collapses. And then within a few days, you have North Vietnamese tanks were on the outskirts of Saigon. And remember, Saigon, it was the capital of South Vietnam, and that's where a lot of the U.S. Military was stationed before they pulled out. But we still have Americans over there. You know, you have the U.S. Embassy. And so what happens is these tanks are on the outskirts. They attack Saigon, and they take it. And while they're doing that, you have a lot of the Vietnamese people escaped with Americans, end up in the U.S., and it was such a rush and such a panic that, and so quick how fast this happened. You had Americans up on top of the roof of the U.S. Embassy having escaped by helicopter. And so when Saigon fell to the communists, South Vietnam surrendered, and this ended the Vietnam War. Legacy of the war, here's some numbers. About 1.4 million Vietnamese, both civilian and military, died. Vietnam, lay in ruins. We had more than 58,000 Americans die in Vietnam, and there were 300,000 that were wounded, many permanently disabled. The war cost the U.S. roughly $150 billion. We have many American soldiers who are classified as MIAs, or missing in action. And relatives demanded that the U.S. pressure the Vietnamese for information on these MIAs. We had several American groups that were allowed to search in Vietnam, but with no success. And most of those missing in action, or MIAs, have remained missing. Now, the soldiers who returned from Vietnam, they did not receive a hero's welcome like many returning soldiers had in the past from previous wars. Many Americans, who didn't support the war, and they just wanted to basically forget about it. So as a result, these soldiers returned, and they were basically ignored, many of them. However, in 1982, a Vietnam Veterans Memorial was constructed in Washington, D.C. Now, the designer was designed by Maya Ying Lin, and it bears all the names of Americans who died or were listed as MIAs. Here are the discussion questions to think about. Number 1, list the 3 parts of Nixon's peace with honor strategy. Number 2, on what basis did people oppose Nixon's bombing of Cambodia? Number 3, what happened in Vietnam after the peace treaty was signed and the U.S. withdrew its troops? Number 4, why did the soldiers who returned to the United States after fighting Vietnam did not receive a hero's welcome? I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and good luck on your test.